Welcome back to the deep dive. I want to start today with a really powerful statement.
Hmm.
It's a belief that sort of crystallized during this massive convergence of climate events in Belém, Brazil.
Hmm.
And it's this: the belief that peace is impossible without ecological protection, and that conversely, ecology cannot be saved while war continues.
That statement is it's so critical
Yeah.
because it immediately yanks the entire climate conversation out of that very narrow technical silo we're used to.
Yeah.
It's no longer just about carbon budgeting or, emission targets. It places the problem squarely in the middle of systemic conflict, social justice, and global militarism. It fundamentally redefines the scope of the whole crisis.
Exactly. And our mission today is to do a deep dive into a stack of sources documenting what happened there in Belém. We're going to be focusing specifically on the observations and the analysis provided by Shermin Güven.
And for our listeners, could you give a bit of background on her?
Of course. She is the co-spokesperson for TV Eco Germany, which is a major ecology movement, and she's also a researcher at the Berlin Frey University's Disaster Research Unit, so she has this dual perspective.
The activist and the academic.
Precisely. And she was on the ground witnessing these three parallel yet profoundly conflicting processes happening all at the same time, right there near the confluence of the Amazon River.
And what makes this material so compelling, I think, is that it's not just a report on one event. It's an expert analysis of this multi-layered moment, a moment that really exposed the deep philosophical fissures in how global powers view the climate crisis versus how local and indigenous communities see it.
It really does. It reveals a battle not over if we should solve climate change, but over the fundamental nature of the solution itself.
Yeah, what a solution even looks like.
So let's set the stage quickly for you, the listener. You have three major processes happening in and around Belém. First, there was the MAR4 international meeting.
That's the movement of people affected by dams. So a very specific frontline group.
Very frontline. Second, you had the massive, open-air, grassroots-organized People's Climate Summit, known locally as the Haklaren Aklimzervasi.
And then the third one.
And third, you have the official state-led behemoth that we all know, COP30.
And our central question throughout this deep dive is really the one that the source material itself poses.
Yeah.
Why did this counter-summit, the People's Summit, emerge with such force? And what fundamental, maybe even irreconcilable differences in worldview did these parallel events expose?
Because what Güven's observations reveal is that these weren't just two groups sitting in different rooms arguing about, policy details.
Yeah.
They were operating under completely different paradigms of reality.
Huh.
One views the crisis as technical, the other sees it as entirely systemic. And this source material, it strongly defends that latter viewpoint.
It makes a powerful case for it.
Okay, let's unpack this.
Yeah.
The location itself, Belém, Brazil, is so important here. I mean, it's where the Amazon River's tributaries meet the vast ocean. It's just intensely symbolic.
It's a place of almost unimaginable biodiversity, a cradle of life. But at the same time, it's a place of immense vulnerability. It's constantly subjected to these pressures from, capitalist expansion, extraction.
And, of course, colonial legacies.
Exactly. It's geographically and ecologically crucial. And that geography sets the stage for this conflict over, really, presence and absence. The source material notes that the official COP30, organized by states and corporations, was physically present in the Amazon.
But it was completely absent from the perspective of the Amazonian people themselves.
That's the paradox.
Yeah.
Geographically there, but socially and culturally a world away.
And Güven's notes, they really detail this stark contrast between the two worlds so vividly. On one side, you have the COP30 structure.
Right. The closed, highly policed, air-conditioned rooms.
The rigid government delegations, the omnipresence of large companies sponsoring everything. It's just this sea of massive advertising for sustainable products.
And what the source describes as this relentless push for green finance presentations. This is the world of crisis management through technical governance.
Let's break that phrase down. What does technical governance actually mean in this context?
It means the core function of COP, in this view, is to process the crisis, to manage it. It seeks solutions within the existing economic framework.
So it carefully avoids any of the profound structural questions.
It has to. It avoids questioning the system that created the climate crisis in the first place. The system based on infinite growth, relentless extraction, and, maximized quarterly profit.
It's like treating a raging fever with a cold compress, but never asking why the body is infected to begin with.
Precisely. You're just managing the symptoms. And in this case, the symptoms are created by global capital, and the so-called solutions like carbon markets often just continue to feed the illness. They monetize destruction rather than halting it.
Okay, so that's one world, but parallel to this corporate governmental fortress, you have this entirely separate, vibrant world.
The People Summit.
The People's Summit, a completely grassroots organized effort. A counter summit held outside in the open air.
With tens of thousands of people. We're talking local indigenous communities, global activists, farmers, students, a real cross-section of civil society.
And significantly, as the source points out, the People's Summit actively engaged with the symbolic geography of Belém. It wasn't just in Belém, it was with Belém.
Yes, they held symbolic actions directly on the Amazon tributaries. There was a boat action where various movements flew their flags. This physical proximity to the source of life and struggle. It's the defining image of the split.
It really is. One group was on the river, the other was in the conference center.
One was connected to the ecosystem, the other was sealed off from it.
So the entire exercise in Belém, from the perspective of the counter summit, was about diagnosing the root illness. And that brings us right back to that core thesis they proclaimed during the Long March.
As long as war continues, ecology cannot be protected. Unless ecology is protected, peace is impossible.
And what the source material does here, and it does it very forcefully, is defend the argument that this indivisible link is the only accurate way to approach planetary survival.
It reframes the whole thing. The climate crisis is not merely an environmental failure, a problem of CO2 levels or plastic waste. It's an existential integrated crisis.
Driven by militarism.
Driven by militarism, ongoing global conflict, and the ecological collapse that results from that. This moves the whole discussion from being a scientific problem to being a political one.
Absolutely. The argument being made is that you cannot genuinely stabilize the planet while states are actively dedicating trillions of dollars and immense resources to systematic destruction.
Just think about the resources consumed by war. The fossil fuels for tanks and jets, the rare minerals for weapon systems, the infrastructure that's destroyed and then has to be rebuilt.
Not to mention the labor, the human potential devoted to military activity instead of ecological transition.
So, that statement isn't just a moral one, it's a material analysis. It's arguing that the global war economy is structurally incompatible with planetary ecological survival.
So the source's defense of this idea is that the global system is actively choosing conflict and the maintenance of militarized borders over the stability of the climate.
And therefore, any solution that accepts the current paradigm of state conflict is inherently doomed to fail from the start.
The physical location of Belém, the meeting of the rivers, really just serves as this perfect backdrop for the meeting of two fundamentally opposing political ecologies.
It really does. One ecology sees the Earth as a massive resource to be managed, regulated, and, technically preserved through finance.
And the other?
The other sees it as an indivisible life system, intrinsically tied to social freedom and political justice. And that distinction, that fundamental difference, dictated everything about how the People's Summit organized itself.
Which leads us right into its unique functioning, its practice.
Exactly. The difference wasn't just in what they protested, but in how they chose to live and practice their politics right there on the ground.
Let's delve into that practice. The MAR4 International Meeting, which kind of kicked off the People's Summit activities, was described by Güven as functioning like a school for peoples.
That phrase is so powerful. A school for peoples, or Haularnokulu.
What does that suggest to you? It's more than just a political gathering.
Or much more. The term school implies pedagogy, right? Collective learning. Not just political mobilization and, giving speeches. The atmosphere was one of practicing the solutions they were advocating for.
So it's not just theory.
It's praxis. Our source material details how attendees, including representatives from TE Eco, organized everything collaboratively. We're talking about logistical details that most conferences would just outsource to massive corporate providers.
Right. They didn't call a catering company or a hotel chain.
Exactly. They stayed together in local schools and public buildings. They jointly organized daily life, from the accommodation and the food to the scheduling of the sessions themselves. The physical act of joint organizing, of practicing community self-reliance became part of the political resistance itself.
So the process was the message.
The process was the message. It wasn't merely talk. It was a functioning, living model of the alternative society they envisioned.
And the discussions themselves reflected this breadth. They were deep, they were integrated, they were covering feminist, anti-colonial, and ecological themes all at once, focusing on these big, overarching concepts like planetary justice.
And that collective practice, that living the alternative, it immediately informed their diagnosis of the crisis. When you are operating outside the capitalist economy, even for a short time, you see its effects much more clearly.
So they didn't define it as a standalone environmental issue?
No, they define it as an integrated system crisis. The sources use the term polycrisis. And it was intertwined explicitly with capitalist modernity, patriarchy, and colonialism.
That term, polycrisis, you hear it a lot in academic circles, but for a listener, why is it so important to use that specific framing? Why not just say climate catastrophe?
Because the strength of the polycrisis framing, and this is what the movements in Baleem strongly defended, is that it resists siloing the problem.
Okay.
If we just talk about climate catastrophe, we might think, a new battery technology is the answer. But if we recognize the polycrisis, we have to acknowledge that the extraction of raw materials for that battery is driven by capitalist modernity.
The labor hierarchy that mines it is maintained by patriarchy.
And the theft of that resource from a sovereign community is enabled by colonialism. It forces you to look at the power dynamics.
So it's all connected.
It's all connected. The environmental issue cannot be separated from the social issue. The problem isn't nature failing. The problem is the structure of global civilization failing. And because the diagnosis is systemic, the proposed solutions have to be systemic too. And they have to come from radically different places.
Which brings us to a crucial point in the source about the origin of knowledge. The People's Summit emphasized that the necessary knowledge, the solutions, they emerge directly from communities.
Yes, particularly from women and indigenous peoples, the very people who are traditionally marginalized and excluded from the COP-style governance structure. The knowledge doesn't come from the corporate or governmental bodies that run COP30.
So this is the fundamental philosophical contrast then. Crisis management versus system transformation.
That's the heart of it. COP confines the crisis to a technical or financial transaction. It can be solved by carbon markets, or a little regulatory tweak, or a new green technology developed by a large corporation.
And what does the People's Summit aim to do instead?
The source is clear. They aim to fundamentally question and then transform the underlying system that's creating the crisis in the first place. They want to move toward practical, foundational answers that are rooted in alternative social organization.
So they're saying we don't need a more efficient spreadsheet for managing resource allocation.
They're saying we need a new way of living altogether, a new relationship between human society and the natural world. And this focus on transformation is what allows for the really powerful transnational solidarity that we see emerging from Baleem.
Okay, here's where it gets really interesting. That shared experience of violence and extraction, coupled with the shared vision of transformation, it became the basis for some very strong alliances.
It really did. Şermin Güven's notes emphasize these connections forged between the Kurdish movement, Latin American indigenous peoples from Abu Yala, various eco-socialists, and feminist groups.
And these connections weren't just based on, general goodwill. They were anchored in 3 specific conceptual pillars.
And these pillars are really the structural foundation of the global alternative being proposed by the Counter Summit. They show that these disparate movements, thousands of miles apart, are converging on the same foundational truths.
Okay, let's start with the first pillar, the concept of territory or land. This seems straightforward on the surface, but the sources imply a really deep philosophical distinction.
It is the most radical distinction, because for these groups, whether we're talking about the perspectives brought from Mesopotamia by TV Eco, or those from the Amazon and the Andes land, or territory, is absolutely not defined as property. It's not mulk.
Okay, and if land is property, milk, then its use is determined by markets, by legality, by profit maximization. You can buy it, sell it, hold it as an asset.
Exactly. If it is milk, it can be seized through eminent domain, it can be developed for profit, or stripped of resources, as long as the paperwork is correct. But when these movements say the land is not property, they mean something entirely different.
They mean it is life.
It is life, it is memory, and it is identity itself. It is indivisible from the community that lives upon it and protects it. It holds their history, their ancestors, their future.
So what is the political consequence of this shared understanding? If land isn't a commodity, then what?
It provides the fundamental basis for rejecting colonial borders, for one,
Hmm.
and crucially for rejecting the entire Kulkunmamuntu, well, the logic of development projects, that justifies resource extraction.
Could you elaborate on that logic of development? What does Kalkunmamantu really entail in this context?
It's the ideology that posits large-scale, often state-backed infrastructure projects, we're talking dams, massive mines, industrial agriculture, as inherently beneficial and necessary for progress.
A kind of greater good argument.
Exactly. It assumes that economic growth, GDP, is the primary measure of human flourishing, even if that growth comes at the cost of traditional ways of life, of local ecosystems, and of cultural memory.
So, by defining land as life and memory, these groups are systematically dismantling the entire philosophical justification for every dam, every mine, and every oil pipeline proposed under the guise of progress.
That's the argument they're making. They are saying you cannot develop away life and memory. From that perspective, the concept of development becomes an act of violence, not progress, when it necessitates the destruction of the very basis of a people's identity. This shared rejection of Kulkanma Mantur is what unites frontline communities globally.
Which brings us smoothly to the second pillar, the eco-feminist approach. The source material suggests a necessary, unbreakable connection between gender violence and environmental destruction.
It's more than a parallel, it's a shared root. This pillar, according to the source, rests on this profound, universally recognized consensus that violence against women and violence against nature share common systemic patriarchal roots.
Explain that link.
The dominant economic and political system views both women and nature as resources to be controlled, exploited, and subordinated for profit and for power. The extraction is both social and ecological.
So the same logic that justifies clear-cutting a forest justifies exploiting female labor.
Precisely. And this is something that's strongly articulated by all the movements represented in Belém, including the analysis brought by TV Eco. Women are often the first to feel the impact of ecological degradation.
How so?
When the water is contaminated, when the forests are cut down, when food supplies fail, it is frequently women who are responsible for securing those resources for their families and communities. They are on the front lines of survival.
And what role, then, did the source say was assigned to women's consciousness in the context of ecological preservation?
This is a key finding. Women's liberation consciousness is seen as the carrier and the preserver of the ecosystem. This perspective was confirmed by participating peoples across the board. In so many of these indigenous and community-led struggles, it's the women who hold the traditional knowledge.
About things like seed banks, sustainable water management.
Exactly, non-extractive farming. Their liberation consciousness, their fight against patriarchal control, inherently translates into a struggle for the freedom and preservation of the ecosystem. The struggle for women's freedom is the struggle for the ecosystem itself.
That makes the feminist struggle not just a side issue, but the central engine for planetary health.
That's the argument. It provides a material, practical solution. It shows that reversing social hierarchy is a necessary precondition for reversing ecological degradation.
And finally, the third pillar, which ties it all together, social ecology and system transformation.
The explicit goal here is the political reestablishment of the relationship between society and nature. This is the synthesis of all the ideas from the People's Summit. The central consensus among the eco-socialist organizations, the local communities, and the Kurdish movement's perspective was the absolute necessity of community self-organization. The Turkish term used is öz örgütlenmesi.
Which explicitly rejects the necessity of state control, correct?
Absolutely. The source material strongly defends the idea that the solution cannot be dependent on the state, because the state is fundamentally implicated in the colonial, patriarchal, and capitalist system that creates the crisis. The state is the enforcer of Mok and Kalkamamantu.
So the solution must be horizontal, local, and community-led.
It has to be.
That is a radical political stance, though, especially on a global stage, typically dominated by international bodies and governments. If the state is entirely rejected as a mechanism for change, what does the source say about the scalability of their solutions? I mean, can community self-organization realistically handle massive issues like regional industrial pollution or coordinating climate policy across huge regions?
That is the ultimate challenge posed by this systemic critique, and the movements in Belém faced it head-on. The defense offered is that our understanding of scalability is flawed.
How so?
The idea isn't that you need a single global bureaucracy to replace the state. It's that you need a global network of resilient, self-organized communities. The strength lies in the replication of successful horizontal practices like the collective living they demonstrated in Belém, not in the vertical imposition of a centralized state solution.
So it's a network, not a hierarchy.
Exactly. The solution grows from the bottom up, through alliances and shared struggles. And what Belém showed was that diverse movements across continents are already engaged in a unified internal search for the exact same forms of resistance and answers. They found a common language.
A common language of resistance rooted in shared experiences of violence and a shared vision of an alternative. That's a powerful platform for future transnational action. And what we need to do now is look at the hard evidence. We need to see where this integrated crisis is visible every single day.
Yes, we've established the framework. Now we need to see the proof. The proof that the climate crisis is inseparable from militarism and colonialism.
Let's move now to a very concrete example, one that illustrates the structural realities that COP30 systematically avoids discussing. We're shifting our focus to the ecological destruction documented in the Kurdish regions, or North Kurdistan.
And Güven presents this as a microexample
Yeah.
that concretely validates the entire systemic critique that was formed at the People's Summit.
Why is this microexample so important?
It's critically important because it provides physical evidence of the inseparable link between war, state policy, and environmental destruction. It's a link that the official COP agenda almost entirely omits because it challenges core narratives of state sovereignty and national security.
Okay, so the first reality examined is the impact of militarization's systematic destruction. The source is explicit that this isn't accidental spillover from conflict, it's direct, intentional action.
We're looking at what amounts to an active policy of environmental warfare. The source details things like systematic forest burning, and that's devastating on multiple levels.
Right, it immediately releases massive amounts of sequestered carbon into the atmosphere, directly contributing to climate change.
And simultaneously, it destroys immense biodiversity that took centuries, maybe millennia, to build. But beyond that, you have the long-term toxicity left behind by mine residues, by unexploded ordnance. These things poison the soil and water for generations.
And what about the infrastructural impact?
The construction of military bases and their accompanying military roads is equally destructive. These projects fragment ecosystems. They carve up continuous habitats that are necessary for wildlife migration and plant health. And critically, they destabilize hydrological systems,
So they alter natural drainage and water flow patterns.
which can lead to erosion in one area or unintended flooding in another. The point this source strongly makes is that this isn't collateral damage. This is an active, sustained regime of destruction that is deliberately engineered to destabilize the region both ecologically and socially, making community self-organization much more difficult.
And while this whole regime of military destruction is completely ignored by COP, they readily embrace certain green solutions, which leads us to the second reality, the myth of green energy, specifically regarding dams.
Right. Dams are often championed by COP attendees and governments as these prime examples of renewable, climate-friendly infrastructure.
But the source details their profoundly destructive effects in these regions. It reveals that their purpose is often political and colonial, not purely energy-related.
In the Kurdish regions, these dams function explicitly as tools of social engineering and control.
How so? What do they do?
Well, for a start, they lead to the forced displacement and emptying of villages. Populations are often relocated far from their ancestral homes, breaking social and cultural ties. They disrupt ancient water regimes, which are essential for traditional agriculture and community stability.
And what about the cultural impact?
That's perhaps the most devastating part. These massive construction projects systematically destroy vital historical and cultural fabrics. They submerge heritage sites, ancient cities like Hassan Kif, and traditional lands that have existed for millennia. All of that is lost forever.
So a technology that is being sold internationally as a climate solution is, for the local communities, just another mechanism of colonization and displacement.
Exactly. It just perfectly highlights the contradiction at the heart of the technical fix approach. The solution being offered by the system is, for many communities, just another form of resource theft wrapped in a pretty green package.
And the third reality brings this global dynamic into sharp focus: mining and green colonialism. This concept is absolutely crucial for understanding why frontline communities are rejecting the COP structure entirely.
Green colonialism describes the structural global inequality that is baked into the so-called transition to renewables. The minerals necessary for the green transformation, we're talking lithium for electric vehicles, cobalt for batteries, copper for solar infrastructure, are demanded by the global north.
But the extraction of those minerals takes place in the living spaces of peripheral populations, often in the global south.
Right. So the richer nations get to decarbonize their energy grids and feel good about it, but they effectively export the environmental devastation necessary to achieve that to poorer regions.
So these peripheries pay the heavy ecological, economic, and cultural costs for the consumption patterns and climate mitigation efforts of wealthier nations.
Precisely. The world's transition to renewables is effectively being subsidized by the displaced livelihoods, the destroyed lands, and the polluted waters of the very communities that had the least to do with causing the climate crisis in the first place.
That puts the entire technical fix paradigm under massive ethical and systemic scrutiny. It doesn't solve the underlying problem of exploitation, it just shifts the disaster zone.
And when you combine the military destruction, the political use of dams, and the pressures of green colonialism, the environmental destruction in the Kurdish provinces is clearly not just an unfortunate side effect of poor planning.
Yeah.
The researcher, drawing explicitly on her disaster research background, defines this as a multi-layered disaster production regime. The Turkish term is afet öğretim rejimi.
Let's focus on that phrase, disaster production regime. Why is that wording so important rather than just saying environmental damage? What does production regime imply about intent?
It implies intentionality in planning rather than accident or poor management. A regime produces outcomes deliberately. The phrase strongly defends the source's argument that the environmental crisis in this region is manufactured by state policy and military strategy. It suggests an intentional, multi-pronged attack on the environment that's intertwined with the systematic oppression of a people. It's disaster by design.
And that structural analysis is key to understanding why they rejected the state-led solutions at COP30.
It has to be.
So despite the centrality of ecology to the Kurdish movement, which the source notes views ecology, democracy, and women's freedom as this indivisible symbiotic triple, there's a major visibility paradox on the international stage. Their fight for land is fundamental, yet it seems to be systematically invisible to many global climate organizations.
And this invisibility is a direct consequence of the issues we just analyzed. International visibility is hampered by state pressure, by criminalization, by the ongoing war conditions. But perhaps the most frustrating factor is the tendency of the international climate movement, including many large established NGOs, to categorize the region not as an ecological crisis zone,
but merely as a political conflict area.
Exactly. And if it's labeled strictly as a political conflict, it allows organizations that prioritize state relations and technical solutions to avoid it. They don't have to challenge sovereignty or military action.
It's a convenient way to sidestep the core issue.
It is. If it's just politics, it doesn't fit neatly into the environmental NGO narrative that's focused on carbon or plastic.
Right.
But if it is an eco-crisis driven by political and military conflict, as the source material strongly argues, then it demands a radical systemic response. A response that challenges the very concept of the nation-state's right to wage environmental war, which many NGOs and governments are deeply reluctant to do.
Yet, the very fact that TV Eco's social ecology and women's freedom line was so strongly embraced and sought out by Latin American indigenous and women's organizations in Belém, it proves that the core concepts are translatable and universally relevant.
Absolutely. The solidarity found there suggests that the potential for international visibility is wide open, provided the frame of analysis shifts from conflict to systemic ecological warfare.
And that necessity of shifting the frame, it clearly informed TV Eco's entire strategy in Belém. They knew that the official COP structure was basically a dead end for their message.
So they focused entirely on building solidarity outside of it.
Their strategy was really clear. Avoid the COP's official blue zone, that sanitized, corporate, and heavily policed area, and instead focus on being in the streets, in the forums, and in the collective spaces with the people.
They understood that the real connections, the real solutions would have to be forged horizontally through shared action and dialogue, not through a press release or a panel in a guarded room.
This approach led to some specific, really powerful symbolic actions that communicated their message visually, beyond just words. They presented the social ecology perspective in panels, sharing life experiences and concrete analysis from Mesopotamia and Rojava.
They participated in that massive long march alongside the MAR movement and all the others.
But the most potent symbolic action, the one mentioned by Güven, was floating the TV Eco flag on the Amazon River itself.
That image is just. It's profound. The flag of an ecology movement rooted in Mesopotamia, the land between the Tigris and Euphrates rivers, thousands and thousands of miles away.
floating on the mighty Amazon.
It speaks volumes. It's a powerful statement that the challenges of environmental destruction, of dam construction, of militarization, they are globally interconnected. The fight for the water of the Amazon is the fight for the water of the Tigris. The global ecosystem is one, and resistance knows no borders.
And this strategy of being in the streets, it facilitated key international connections. It forged what could be lasting alliances centered on this shared structural analysis.
The diversity of the contacts they made is highly indicative of the strengths of their message. They met with Amazon indigenous women's organizations and Afro-Amazonia communities, who are the frontline defenders against deforestation and extraction.
They also connected with water, land, and forest defenders from Africa and numerous Latin American ecofeminist movements.
And one specific, very meaningful contact mentioned in the source was with Bertha Zuniga Caceres.
She is the Lenca activist whose mother, the renowned Berta Caceres, was assassinated for opposing a dam in Honduras.
The fact that Zuniga Caceres, a figure who was so deeply familiar with state and corporate violence against land defenders, was eager to understand the Kurdish women's and ecological perspective. It just highlights that there is a profound shared language of struggle.
A language that completely bypasses official diplomatic and NGO channels.
Yes, they immediately recognized the systemic root of their oppression in each other's stories.
There were also crucial academic and political links made. The source mentions a representative from the Simón Bolívar Institute for Peace in Venezuela, and also a person from a Palestinian Environment and Freedom Collective.
That breadth of engagement, from frontline indigenous activists to international academic networks, it lays a foundational basis for deep, meaningful transnational solidarity.
And when you summarize the unifying traits of all these local and indigenous movements that they encountered in Belém, from the Amazon, Palestine, Africa, Kurdistan, a powerful pattern emerges.
It really does. They all face colonial violence from states and corporations. For all of them, land is fundamentally identity and life, not property. Militarization targets their ecosystems uniformly.
And critically, in every single region, women lead the struggle. They are often the first to mobilize against these destructive projects.
And the resistance is consistently defined by community-based action, by horizontal organization, and by solidarity-driven efforts. This convergence of practical resistance models is perhaps the most hopeful finding from Belém. It validates the entire systemic critique laid out in the source material.
So it solidifies the idea that while the Kurdish struggle is unique, in being integrated with a specific political and identity movement in a divided geography.
Its core principles of social ecology, that integral link between ecology, women's freedom, and democracy, resonate universally because they tackle the poly-crisis at its shared structural root.
It proves the argument that the local solution, community self-organization, is in fact the universal solution.
That's the powerful conclusion.
And this leads to a very forward-looking strategic point that was clearly articulated in the source. The next COP is scheduled to be held in Turkey.
And this is highlighted as a crucial turning point for the entire movement.
It seems like a massive opportunity.
It is. The move offers a platform to dramatically increase visibility for the ecological destruction in the region that the source material has detailed, the impact of dams, militarization, and green colonialism. It provides a strategic pivot point to build new anti-colonial ecology lines, linking Turkish, Kurdish, and global ecology movements.
It forces the world to confront the systemic issues we've been discussing: war, patriarchy, and resource extraction, right on the doorstep of the official proceedings. It makes them impossible to ignore.
Absolutely. The source emphasizes that the global ecosystem is indivisible. You cannot segment it by continents or political borders. Therefore, the required solidarity must grow in parallel. The political focus shifting to Turkey forces a spotlight onto this critical and too often overlooked nexus of military and ecological destruction.
So to review and synthesize everything we've learned from Şermin Güven's comprehensive observations in Belém, the official state-led climate solution model, the one embodied by COP30, is fundamentally insufficient.
It fails. And it fails because it treats the symptom. It focuses on technical and financial fixes rather than addressing the systemic cause.
A cause which the movements collectively identified as capitalist modernity, colonialism, patriarchy, and war.
That is the essential lesson, and it's one strongly defended by this material. COP30 was focused on managing the crisis within the confines of existing power structures. The People's Summit was focused on fundamental system transformation, rooted in community self-organization and an integrated social ecology.
And the most important takeaway for you, the listener, is the hard-won lesson from Belém. States cannot solve the climate crisis.
And why? because they are too deeply entangled in the very structures of power, profit, and violence, the very effet irritium regime that caused the crisis. They're either the perpetrators or the beneficiaries of the global extractive economy.
But the source offers a hopeful alternative.
It does. The solution inherently grows when peoples connect and organize horizontally, when they embrace community self-organization that is, or Gitland-Mazy, as the primary vehicle for change.
That brings us back to the stark paradox observed on the ground. COP30 was physically in the Amazon. It was geographically present.
But the source noted it was entirely not with the Amazonian people. It concluded without any genuine representation or any profound self-criticism regarding the colonial and military violence that defines the region.
So we want to leave you with this provocative thought that challenges the very definition of climate action.
If the official structures of change are geographically present but socially absent, what obligation does that place on us, the listener, to bypass those official structures?
How can we better support movements that prioritize community-led systemic transformation over the technical administration of disaster?
Because the crucial work, the work of genuine change, is clearly not happening in the closed, air-conditioned rooms. It's happening on the rivers and in the streets.
Thanks for diving deep with us. We'll see you next time.